Hello friends, Rodge here. This time we're painting a nasty little goblin for my Heroquest collection. These were painted almost exclusively with Scalecolor paints. This paint line can be challenging for beginners, so I've got a couple thoughts on how to make things easier for you. You'll see how I do these blends, and I'll show you an interesting way to do some sweet, heavy metal. If we're talking Scalecolor, we really need to revisit the basics. First up, they're gel-based, so you really need to shake the tar out of these things, especially when you're cracking them open for the first time. It sort of feels like these paints were bottled before the original Heroquest set was even released, and they've been sitting in a warehouse somewhere for 30 years. I mean, keep shaking, man. If you see clear stuff when you're squeezing, that's no good. It means you got to shake even more. Keep it going. With the goopy gels inside, you do have to add a drop or two of water every time. Even if you're going to do some dry brushing, I'd still add the water. Mixing it up with my little dental hook here. I always feel like a brush steals too much paint. Anyways, I have to say the Scalecolor is great on a wet palette. These things last forever. If left a couple days, the Vallejos will spread out, get kind of weird and unusable. Where the Scalecolors, they kind of just shrink up like a prune, and add a couple drops of water, give it a stir, and you're good to go. Over a minute and a half in, and finally we get to that stupid goblin. I've got him primed black, and I'm base coating purple. I airbrushed the purple base coat on all the other ones, but for the video, I'm base coating by hand like some chump. So I'll explain what I'm doing with the brush first, then while you're watching that, I'll go back and explain why exactly I would want to do this. If you want a base coat with Scalecolor, essentially you need to do 2 or more thick coats. I'm using a nice rounded brush and piling on the paint equally in the cracks and on the wider surfaces. I'm looking for a nice wet sheen. I'm constantly working my way from the edges and never going back to a wet part to reapply anything. If you think you didn't get enough paint on a certain part, get it on the next pass after it's dried. Okay, so why do I think it needs to be done this way? It's time for that warning in the video description. The translucent properties of Scalecolor means that if you base coat in a traditional manner, I'm thinking 2 thin coats applied quickly, you'll end up with a splotchy mess. So my advice is to not use Scalecolor for base coats. If you're really set on using the Scalecolors, best way to do it is with an airbrush. With a little water and a little thinner, the paints flow beautifully through the airbrush, and you can get a good result with 2 thin coats. But if you don't want to use different paints and you don't want to use an airbrush, then I recommend the technique you've been seeing for the last minute or so. The issue is it's super time consuming. It took 8 minutes just to do this first layer and basically 8 minutes for the second time. I did time a quick coat with the traditional method, and base coating that way only took about a minute and a half. If you were doing 10 models, that's like an extra 2.5 hours for no good reason. For my Heroquest figs, I just used the airbrush. I only subjected myself to this special method of torture specifically for the video. You're welcome. Finally, we got 2 thick coats of purple onto the goblin, and we're ready to start building up our colors. I've been calling purple the base coat color, so you may think that's the midtone on this guy, but it's actually the darkest color, the shade, if you will. I'm going to use the Scalecolor paints to build up layers to a midtone and highlight on each of the different sections here. His skin, his shirt, little booties and a belt, and the metal. As you can see, I'm doing the skin first. I'm using the base coat technique I just discussed to block out a strong green color where the highlight and mid-tone is going to be. So still laying it on pretty thick at this point, as I want to try and cover that purple base coat. Once that's done, I'm going to thin my paint down and really use these Scalecolors the way that I think they're intended. With the green base coat down, I'm going back with a mix of green and purple. This mix will be half covering the purple maybe half covering the green. The paint is finally thinned down to a nice skim milk consistency. So it's going to be pretty translucent, and a little bit of extra purple is going to show through on those sections, and a little bit of green underneath is going to poke through, and we're going to get a nice transition pretty easily here. I could have started with purple, do the purple green mix, then work up to the green and sort of build up the layers. But on these large areas, blocking it out first, I think helps me get the right proportions of shadows, midtones, and highlights that I want. On the smaller bits, like his shoes, the belt, or on the shirt, where it has those ridges, and it's not going to be a judgment call about where the highlights go, then I'll just build it up from the purple all the way up to the highlight. You'll see. Once the transition between shadow midtone is down, I'm moving on to the highlight. And for this, I'm mixing in a little blue. I'm going for a nice cold highlight on these. And maybe this is the good time to elaborate on exactly what I'm doing here and why I'm starting with purple. Well, I'm going for a unnatural sort of look on my Heroquest monsters. So I'm going to use warm shadows and cold highlights to help accomplish this. This will be in contrast to the heroes when I get to them, who will have cold shadows and warm highlights, which is a more natural look. If you're outdoors, the highlights will tend to come from the sun, a nice warm color if there ever was one. Compare that to the shadows. They're never really pitch black. They're still getting a little bit of ambient light from the blue sky. So if you're ever working on a model and something ain't quite right, it could be a warm shadow or cold highlight kind of throwing you off. So this highlight seems good, but I know I got to juice it up a little bit. And now it's time for one more Scalecolor quirk here. And actually, I'm going to elevate this to full warning status, as this can be extremely frustrated if you don't understand what's going on. So this other potential issue is that Scalecolor dries much darker than the wet paint on the palette would lead you to believe. So I think all paint probably has this issue slightly, but I've never seen it so far off as with Scalecolor. But if you think about it, it makes sense given the translucent properties. So these highlights look absolutely sizzling, but they're going to calm down and kind of merge with the paint I already have on there. So something to keep in mind and be prepared for. It can make going back to prior models and trying to match those colors with your eyeballs a real challenge. I've jumped in to highlight something I did a couple days ago. I think I have a nice jump in brightness, but once it dries, it doesn't even look like I did anything. And I've talked to other people where that same thing has happened. So please be aware. With the highlight down, it's time for what I call a kind of a tug of war phase with the green or the mixes to either get more transition in there between the highlight, midtone, or shadow, or just to beef up one of those colors. And this is a challenge actually, specifically on smaller models like this Goblin. There just isn't a lot of room. So oftentimes the issue is going right from shadow to highlight and not having much of a midtone in between. On a larger model, you'll have plenty of room for the shadow, midtone, and highlight, and oftentimes it's more about getting a nice transition between those layers. The other problem I have specifically with this Goblin is I already painted most of them and he's looking a little darker than the rest. So I'm going to bring him in line a little bit. He'll still be a little darker, but
sometimes Goblins is darker.
After cleaning the skin up a bit, I'll add the pink for his nose, lips, and ears. This is actually a flesh tone, so it'll be pretty subdued. Same general idea as what I did on the skin. Build up some layers. And now I'm ready to finish the skin once and for all. There's actually one more step to really get this guy popping. It's all about that contrast. I don't want to push the cold highlights any further, but I think I can heat up those shadows just a little bit with a targeted yellow wash. This is the GW yellow wash, and it's super strong, so I need to be really careful. If I accidentally get this over a cold highlight, it's going to totally wreck it. So I'm just going to keep it to the shadows and maybe halfway up the green midtones. And it's really going to help pop those green midtones as well and give us a nice contrast versus the kind of bluish highlights. Like I said, this stuff is pretty strong, so I'm wiping off the excess load on the brush onto the paper towel there. You can see it's not turning it yellow. It's just giving it a nice warm glow in those darker areas. And it's quite an interesting effect. It definitely gives them an underground dungeon feel. You know, it just looks like there's a torch nearby, kind of casting this ambient warm light, which is getting picked up in the shadows. I definitely recommend playing around with this on your next test model. For bad guys, I never do an iris or pupil. Bam! It's just glowing white. Bam! Moving on quickly to his boots. The belt and handle of the axe will be the same colors, but I'm not going to show those. I'm going in with a light brown and sort of doing arbitrary lines on his shoe there. There are some folds sculpted on there, but I'm just ignoring them. Once that's done, I'll give it a dark brown GW wash. This will help break up the model a bit, giving brown shadows contrast to the warm purple on his skin. And I'm making sure to get into the cracks between the skin and the boot. This will give it a nice dark transition line, and I won't have to do any black lining later. After that, I'm going back to that same light brown to build up the color. I like to head towards pink or peach on my leathers. I'm going to mix in a little blue to give them a cold highlight just like the skin. You can see the highlights getting smaller and smaller as I go up here. After the boots here, it's time to move on to the shirt, and I didn't really have a plan on what color I was going to use. I've already done most of the goblins. We got blue, red, yellow, gray. So I was thinking orange leather kind of color for this guy. And it's kind of hilarious because the color is going to end up almost the same as the boots and leather here. So I'm giving you two different ways to achieve essentially the same result. I'm leaving purple in the cracks and just working with the folds I have. Not making anything up on this one. It's fairly straightforward. And I'll be working towards lighter colors up towards the top. On the other colors, I used a matching wash, similar to how I did it on the boots. When I had blue, I did a blue wash. Red, I did a crimson wash. On this one, I just leave that strong purple contrast. The way purple and orange are on the color wheel, it just looks good to me. For the last little bit of the video here, we're going to jump into the metallics. So on the axe blade here, obviously starting with that purple base coat, I'm actually using a blue tinted metallic paint. I'm not sure what alphabetical acronym applies to this technique. I know of NMM and TMM. What we're doing here really isn't either. I'm doing the shiny bits with metallics, and the darker bits are just the normal, I guess, chromatic paints. This seems to work best when there's really clear beveled edges for the weapons or the armor. As if you do need to mix them and do some kind of transition between the metallic, chromatic parts, finding that right mix can be a tricky business. So every color up to this point has been Scalecolor, but this is the one instance where I'm using Vallejo Scorched Brown. I'm going to use that to pump the warm shadows, and it mixes quite well with that Scalecolor purple. I do the edges in more of a silver metallic, and some spot highlights with their white metallic. Overall, the effect is quite striking as realism and light theory goes. I think there is something here if you chose more realistic colors. Even dark metallic paint has those shiny speckles, so depending what you're going for, using chromatic for the darker bits might give you a good effect. Sad to say, the basing got a little bit away from me on this one. It's not really representative of what I did on the others. And with how much time I spent on the Scalecolor basics in the beginning, I don't really have time to shove it in here anyways. I know.
The only reason I clicked on the darn video was to see the basic.
But I have plenty of Heroquest models left, and in the future, we'll come back to one, and I'll explain how to do the basing at that time. Let's take a look at some finished pics. And let's see how he stacks up against the others. I used all the same techniques on the orcs as well. And even the big blue femur, sort of inverting the skin a bit, purple to blue, the light cold green. I really like how these guys look as a group, and I have to say they're very eye-catching from the 3 to 4 feet away eye level. So ideal for a good quality result on your tabletop models. Stick around to get the specific paints and brushes I used. Jump over to Twitter or Instagram to see more pics of these and other models as well. Or if you have any thoughts or ideas about what you saw, drop down below and hit me up in the comments. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Sometimes Gabos is darker.